Well, the flights have been coming in here steadily at Stansted, Kathy, to the tune of an almighty ticking clock. 2 flights have arrived today. Another one is due, as you say, while we're on air. And there were 6 flights yesterday. Now, hours are whipping by towards the end of the ceasefire. That is officially due, as you say, at midnight tonight, although we should stress that there have been plenty of reports of gunfire and aerial bombardment in Sudan. So you can imagine when British nationals hear the Foreign Secretary here talking about now is the time to move, just how terrifying that is. And there's also a question of how much information British nationals are actually getting on the ground from the Foreign Office in Sudan. We spoke to a 21-year-old earlier today. She arrived back today, and she was saying that she was getting very little information on how to get to the airbase in Sudan to get back here. And she will tell her own story in her own words shortly. And lastly, it was very sobering today watching people getting off the plane, so tentatively walking down those flight steps after a really long, tiring and frightening journey. It's very difficult to give you an accurate figure on the number of people who are on that flight, just as it is impossible to measure the emotional impact this has had on people. We spoke to one mum who came to a hotel today to greet her teenage daughters, who she hasn't seen since the beginning of this conflict. Who have you come to meet?
My daughter. I have 2 daughters coming today.
Have you been able to keep in touch with them the whole time?
Not all the time. Not all the time. Yeah, sometime. Yeah, you know, because the electric is off, the internet sometimes off.
How are you feeling at this moment?
I can't describe my feeling now.
Well, they're here, you'll see them very soon. How's the journey been?
It was all right, very long, but it was all right. We got here in the end.
How long did it take?
I left Sudan, well, I left my house in Sudan on Tuesday at 6 p.m. Yes, it's been quite a journey.
When you left, how were things?
It was quite bad, to be honest. The journey was long, got dark, but in the end, yeah, it was all right.
And in terms of the journey that side, did you have to pass through roadblocks?
Oh yeah, we got stopped like every 10-15 minutes. They'd come and search the bus, then they'd get down, keep going, just that kept happening until we got to the military airbase where we were leaving from.
And what was that like every time they were coming on?
It was quite scary, to be honest, but yeah, you get used to it after a while.
And so, in terms of how you're feeling,
oh, I'm very happy to be back home. Yeah, it's a good feeling.
and that side, was there good communication in terms of getting to the airport, in terms of getting out of the country, do you feel?
I feel like we were kind of left alone to make our own ways there. But in general, after that, everything was all right. Communication was good once we got to the airbase.
Tonight we've heard from the government that 897 people have been evacuated, British nationals that is, have been evacuated from Sudan so far, but there are still thousands of people waiting to get out, and we also know that the government is lobbying to extend the ceasefire. Kathy.
Ria, thanks very much. Jackie.
While international attention has been focused on foreigners, it's Sudanese civilians most at risk. Hundreds have been killed in the fighting, with thousands injured. Despite the ceasefire, there's been gunfire and explosions in parts of the capital, Khartoum, while armed fighters have all rampaged through a city in the western Darfur region, forcing residents to flee their homes. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, reports.
Everything is destroyed, he says as he films. What horror in Bahri, to the north of Khartoum, where some of the most intense fighting has taken place, leaving bodies strewn on the ground. So much for the ceasefire. Government fighter jets flew over Khartoum and Omdurman yesterday and through the night, while the paramilitary rapid support forces took potshots. If fleeing is dangerous, then so is staying at home. This house was hit in the first few days, and an elderly woman, Awatif Abdullah, was killed.
The shrapnel hit our house. She was in the kitchen, and the metal went through her heart. Our daughter screamed, but by the time I got there, she was already dead.
Her grandchildren are bewildered. Overnight, their lives changed. One day, normal, peaceful. The next, full of violence and fear. Dr. Hawida Al-Hassan filmed the scene at Al-Ban Jadid Hospital in Khartoum, where she works as a gynecologist. The wards are full of injured people, and they're running short of medical supplies, she says. International aid agencies have stocks in Khartoum, but today a Médecins Sans Frontières team trying to deliver supplies to hospitals got held up by fighting.
Unfortunately, there was a clashes close to the warehouse, or our warehouse, and there was aerial bombarding. It was very close, and we had to seek shelter and try to postpone the movement until everything is clear.
People are queuing 2 or 3 days for fuel, which gets more scarce and expensive by the hour. Petrol stations open in the afternoon and at night, and you have to stay to keep your place in line. If there's no resupply soon, it will be impossible to drive the injured to hospital or leave the city to head for safer parts of the country. Some Khartoum residents have made it to the border with Egypt. They need the correct documents to pass and relatives or money to survive on the other side, because who knows when it'll be safe to go back home. No wonder they're bitter and angry with the generals whose greed for power and wealth brought them to this.
May God take revenge on the tyrants and everyone who displaced the people of Sudan and everyone who broke Sudan and was greedy for the resources of our country.
Most of the fighting is in Khartoum, with isolated clashes in Merowe, Sidarov and Edzamazin. But there have also been battles and reports of widespread looting in Darfur, especially in the towns of Niala and El Geneina, sending tens of thousands of refugees across the border to Chad. This was El Geneina today. Only a few pictures are emerging from Darfur because the internet is down. Here it's not just two factions fighting, but a total breakdown of law and order.
The dynamic of the fighting has changed into an ethnic conflict, and that resulted in looting of the police headquarters, and over 500 light weapons were looted, and as a result of that, chaotic situation took place in the city.
Some of the adults fleeing to Chad may have made the same desperate journey as children 20 years ago, when an uprising in Darfur was put down with massacres carried out by the same army and paramilitaries who are fighting each other now. Today's conflict has its roots in that time, but threatens to be even more destructive and cruel.
Well, earlier I spoke to David Miliband, the head of the International Rescue Committee, which has teams currently working in the states of Blue Nile and Gedaref. I began by asking him about the situation on the ground.
We have about 150 to 200 staff members on the ground, both in Khartoum and in two provinces in which we're working to deliver health and other very basic services. There's a lot of tension. The fighting, as far as we're concerned, has been confined to Khartoum, although there are reports from elsewhere in the country. But as far as we're concerned, we're carrying on delivering our services outside Khartoum.
So how possible is it for you to operate at the moment, given, escalating violence in Darfur in particular? And what kind of aid are you able to deliver? What are you actually able to do?
Well, there are refugees from Ethiopia. There are internally displaced people. This is a country that's been ravaged by conflict and also by climate change, actually. Just to give you a sense of proportion, there are 45 million people living in Sudan. 15 million of them depend on humanitarian aid to survive. And so it's the basics. It's basic healthcare, it's basic water and sanitation, it's basic food and cash support. And it's needed even more than ever. Just to give you a sense of perspective, only 14% of the UN's humanitarian appeal is funded this year. So funds are desperately short and needs are growing.
And when you look at the political response to what's going on, Suella Braverman, for example, has ruled out introducing a safe and legal route for those people wanting to escape. You talked about 45 million Sudanese who are stuck now in what is becoming a war zone. Do you urge her to reconsider that decision, or do you understand where she's coming from politically?
Well, I think that the UK's unwillingness to recognise its legal, never mind moral obligations to people who are fleeing for their lives is reprehensible. However, it's also important to say that the 45 million people who are in Sudan, the 15 million humanitarian need, they're Sudanese and they want to live a life in Sudan. Just 4 years ago, they had the prospect of a transition from military rule to civilian rule. And the suggestion that somehow there are millions of Sudanese waiting to come to the UK just isn't borne out by the facts. What we know is that people have commitments, they have families, some of them have businesses, but they need a functioning economy and a functioning society. And at the moment, we're in emergency mode. We need to make sure that the funding gaps are filled, that people are kept alive, and above all, that the ceasefire continues, and or to pick up a point you made earlier, is actually improved upon, because there are these reports of sporadic fighting.
Nevertheless, there are obviously people with links to British citizens, family members and so on, who aren't currently eligible to come to the UK in this evacuation scheme. Would you like those restrictions lifted as a matter of urgency or not?
The vital thing is that Britain lives up to its obligations to those who are British citizens or those who have British links. Equally, I'm very concerned that while there are important issues about the hundreds or thousands of people who need to get out of the country, what about the millions who are still in the country? And there's a grave danger that there's a total loss of perspective, not just by the British government, which after all has slashed its aid across Africa, but also in the rest of Europe, where there aren't aid cuts, but the almost exclusive focus on evacuation is taking away from the desperate need to meet the needs of millions of people who are going to be staying in Sudan.
So when it comes to those tens of millions of Sudanese citizens who are seeing their neighbourhoods turned into battlegrounds, is there any country, any leader, any organisation who can try and bring those two generals to their senses and negotiate some kind of deal between them?
Well, first of all, the fighting is in the main in Khartoum. So in large swathes of the country, it's not that life is normal, there's a lot of tension, but people are going about their business. Sudan is a very important country geopolitically, never mind geographically. It has very strong links into the Gulf, as well as into North Africa and Egypt. And as you've seen over the last 3 or 4 days, the United States is an important actor as well. Secretary Blinken, Tony Blinken, announced the ceasefire and has played an important diplomatic role. So I think this needs to be a global effort, not just a regional one.
And just finally and briefly, how imminent is the danger of a full-blown civil war in your view?
Well, I think that's been staved off over the last few days, and it's desperate that we intensify the diplomacy, or that the diplomacy is intensified to make sure that that vicious and awful prospect doesn't become a reality.
David Miliband, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.